It was July of 2024 when I hit submit on my PhD and download on Baldur's Gate, the RPG that would win Game of the Year back in 2023, the game that I was destined to make my entire personality in lieu of my thesis. It has now been 7 months since that moment, and in that time I can say proudly that I have clocked up 2,000 hours in that game. Just to put in perspective how many hours that actually is. In 2,000 hours, you could watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy 164 times. That's a full-time job in Middle-earth. If you walked at an average pace of 5 kilometers an hour, you could make it 1/4 of the way around the Earth. Or you could sit through 800 full Shakespeare plays, which is simply enough to start dreaming in iambic pentameter. What makes Baldur's Gate 3 so obsessive as a video game is that you can truly play it any way that you want to play it. You can play it to become the hero or the villain of Baldur's Gate. You can play it for its beautifully written stories and side plot lines. You can play it for its tactical combat to really prove your prowess on the battlefield. Or you can play it like me, for its many romanceable companions that you can have relationships with and
Hello, beautiful.
Yep, I essentially paid $80 for a high graphics dating simulator. Now in my 2,000 hours, I have experienced many of the romance options available in this game. But there is only one particular set of pixels that stole my heart from the very beginning. And that is Gale, the Wizard of Waterdeep.
Hello, I'm Gale of Waterdeep.
We're so cute together. Now, I'd say the wizard and I share many commonalities. We both have great relationships with our mum, we like to info dump about books, we're both cat people, but granted his cat also has wings and can fly. It is a fantasy game after all. And we're both trying to retrospectively unpack some of the trauma left upon us from past relationships. What else could you want in a man? Now, in the height of my Baldur's Gate obsession last year, which was also fueled by the fact I was in bed rest post-surgery, it did occur to me. I was spending more hours every week with Gale, the Wizard of Waterdeep, than I was my real-life boyfriend. I'd essentially got a whole virtual relationship going on here. Not to mention all of the freaky stuff we were getting up to in the sky. Thank you so much to the animators for that scene. But it got to the stage that one day my in-real-life boyfriend came home from work, and he's wonderful, and he walked in the door, found me, recovering, playing my game, and he's like, "Hi honey, how are you? Anything I can get you, just let me know." And I was actively annoyed. I was so frustrated that that man had the audacity to walk through the door, because in that very moment, he had interrupted me and Gale, the Wizard of Waterdeep, having a beautiful romantic boat ride in space. Again, it's a fantasy game. And while my in-real-life boyfriend is going like, "Hi honey, how are you?" Gale, the Wizard of Waterdeep, was like,
With you I forget, my goddess. I love you.
When I say he wasn't the only one who was Waterdeep. But anyway, that's when I realized I might have a bit of a problem. Because when you start becoming a top posting member on the Wizard of Waterdeep on Facebook, it does make you question whether or not this kind of obsession is entirely normal. And that is when I started to deep dive into this thing called fictosexuality. The term fictosexuality describes the desire to engage in sexual relationships with fictional characters. Fictoromance describes the romantic attraction to fictional characters. Now, there are two very distinct ways in which this term is used. The first is as a sexual identity. It comes under the umbrella of grey asexuality and describes people who only feel sexual or romantic desire for fictional characters. And they don't experience these kind of desires for people in real life. The second way is to describe the experience of feeling sexual desire or romantic desire for a fictional character. And this is an incredibly common human experience, which is going to be our focus today. I think it's important to distinguish these two uses of the word because they're often used interchangeably. And I think that undermines that for many people, this is a genuine sexual identity. But you don't have to identify as fictosexual to have a fictosexual experience. And this can happen while watching TV, watching Mr Darcy in a pond with a wet t-shirt, reading books about High Lord fairy kings, or yes, like playing Baldur's Gate for 2,000 hours. Now, I'm a sex historian, and so obviously the first place that I was going to start researching was in the history of fictosexuality. And for some spoilers for this video, I am happy to confirm that this isn't a new phenomenon, even though we now have contemporary terms to be able to understand it. But there are new things that have changed the way that we today may experience fictosexuality that they didn't in ancient Rome or 18th century England, such as immersive role-playing video games, AI character chatbots that you can have intimate relationships with, robots, fan fiction, social media communities, James Masters taking off his top in the 6th season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There are a lot of things that make our experience today uniquely different, and I think we need to understand history first before we can understand and actually decide how we are going to approach a world that is changing every single day when it comes to media and attraction via different forms of technology. We have always created fantasy lovers. From the gods of Olympus to the knights of Camelot, courtly sonnets and gothic vampire lovers. Fictional desire isn't this modern romance glitch, it's probably one of the oldest love stories that we have. So if you've ever felt too emotionally attached to a dragon riding baddie, you are not alone. You are just participating in a centuries-long tradition of getting absolutely wrecked by someone who doesn't exist. So it's time to Lestat. Let's get into it. That one was awful. Yeah, that was terrible. Our journey starts, as always, back in the ancient world. Long before Mr Darcy caused anyone to drop their embroidery hoop, the ancient Greeks were carving out their crushes in marble. Our first stop on the fictional thirst train is Pygmalion, sculptor, bachelor, and downright simp. The tale of Pygmalion comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and this ancient story is essentially about the experience of ficto-romance. Now, Pygmalion is a sculptor in ancient Cyprus, and he finds himself dissatisfied with the women available for him to marry. He finds himself detesting beyond measure the flaws which nature has given to women. Essentially, Pygmalion is the OG incel. And so, dissatisfied, he decides to take matters into his own hands. He carves his perfect woman out of ivory. And she is beautiful, flawless, and so Pygmalion finds himself falling madly in love with his creation. He starts speaking to the statue, caressing it, adorning it in beautiful jewels. And then he starts praying to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, every single night, like, please Aphrodite, please make my creation real, make my dream woman come to life. And Aphrodite's like, yeah, absolutely Pygmalion, this was getting really weird to watch. And so the statue becomes real, and Pygmalion and the sculpture marry and live happily ever after. In many ways, Pygmalion is like this ancient archetype of fictosexuality. Not just loving what isn't real, but loving because it isn't real. And I don't think this is the only example from this time and place. If I may be so bold, the relationships that we had to deities in places like ancient Rome and ancient Greece were quite lustful. This is very different to the kind of relationship that many of us would be familiar with, to monotheistic gods that are omnipotent and removed and all-powerful. These gods were very present in the life of the people, and we were down bad for a lot of them. These gods were deeply involved in human drama while also cooking up drama storms of their own. It's kind of like polytheistic Tinder if it was a reality TV show, which on that note, I would absolutely watch. But we only need to look at the ways that we wrote about these gods to kind of see a comparable way that we write about fan fiction and fictional characters today. There is a lusting and a yearning there while conscious of the real non-reality, which is kind of like an ancient foundation for the experience of fictosexuality. I mean, my god, most of them were pretty dramatic and emotionally unavailable. Our ancient ancestors didn't stand a chance. Now let's fast forward considerably past the togas and the plagues and into the 18th century. This is the birth of the sentimental and pornographic novel, genres designed to stir your soul and get you all hot beneath your petticoat. These books weren't just popular, they were emotional and social events. Readers cried over them, wrote letters to the author, held public debates about fictional plot twists. take Samuel Richardson's Pamela. Pamela was a widely popular novel about a poor maid who resists the sexual advances of her wealthy employer, Mr. B, until he eventually reforms and then marries her. It's kind of like if Bridgerton had a deeply problematic corporate HR plotline. Now, Pamela's character was hailed by many as being the pinnacle of feminine strength and virtue, whereas others considered her a fraud, disguising her horny ways behind an act of piety. In fact, Pamela's character lived many lives out of the original novel. Other authors used the character of Pamela in their own works, either continuing her tales or writing about the stories of Shamala, exposing her for the real wanton, gold-digging lady she actually was. And the same thing happened with Mr. B's character, with readers and other authors loving him, hating him, wanting to see him punished, or knowing that they can fix him. And if this reminds you of modern fandom discourses, you would be right. And if you thought readers were passionate about Pamela, my gosh, they absolutely lost their minds when Samuel Richardson decided to drop Clarissa. Published in 1748, Richardson's Clarissa is a million-word brick of a novel and an emotional sledgehammer. The story follows Clarissa, a virtuous woman who is manipulated, abducted, and eventually assaulted by a seductive and morally bankrupt rake called Lovelace. The book is painful, violent, and it was wildly popular. Readers weren't just moved by Clarissa's story, they fell in love with her. In fact, readers found themselves so deeply attached to her character that they would write to the author, Samuel Richardson, and implore him to give Clarissa a better ending, to give her the love that she deserves, to let her survive. The way that they spoke about Clarissa was though she was a real person. And this era of readership really exposes this emotional investment and love that we have for characters. Even fan letters about the character of Lovelace were kind of torn between desire and repulsion. Because even after the many crimes that he commits in this book, readers were still trying to grapple with the fact that they still found him irresistible. Honestly, it's giving problematic fave. People didn't just read Clarissa, they identified with her, projected onto her, grieved for her. And the letters they wrote were as though they knew her and had a responsibility towards her. That's not just engagement, that's emotional entanglement, and it's definitely an early example of fictosexuality. What's so important about this era that really saw the birth of the romance, sentimental, pornographic novel is what it exposes about the way that we as readers engage with fiction. Fiction becomes a safe place to explore things like love, virtue, violence, longing. We're able to explore and experience these kind of emotional journeys, and we're able to discuss these experiences with other readers and with the authors themselves. And I want to highlight that concept of safe space because we will return to that later when we look at the benefits that emotional engagement with fictional characters can give to us. But make no mistake, it's not just love stories where we see this attachment start to arise with fictional characters. We can find it in some adventure mysteries as well. How could we have this conversation without mentioning Sherlock Holmes? Now, it needs no explanation that Sherlock Holmes still holds ground in fandoms today. Maybe some of you tuned into this video because of Benedict Cumberbatch's performance. But especially when Conan Doyle's books first dropped, we saw this fandom in full flight. A mass amount of letters were written and sent to the fictional address of 221B Baker Street. These, of course, were written to Sherlock Holmes as though he were real. In fact, someone was actually employed for many years to read and to respond to these letters as though they were Sherlock Holmes, which probably only added to the confusion of whether Sherlock Holmes was real or not. Because even as recently as 2008, a majority of British teenagers seemed to believe that Sherlock Holmes was in fact a real person. The people's emotional attachment to Sherlock Holmes really came to the surface when Doyle tried to kill his protagonist off. The readers rioted. So many distressed readers wrote letters to the Strand magazine publisher, and it's reported that 20,000 people cancelled their subscriptions in protest. And it wasn't just the publisher who felt the anguish. Conan Doyle himself received countless letters, some describing Sherlock Holmes' death as a personal loss, and others just insulting the author and calling him a brute. There is even a legend that Londoners started to wear black armbands in mourning after the loss of Sherlock Holmes. Many literary historians have said that the public reaction we saw to Sherlock Holmes' death was like nothing we've ever seen before to a fictional event. Clarissa really died so Sherlock Holmes could be revived. Of course, Conan Doyle was pretty much forced to bring Sherlock Holmes back with Hound of the Basilisk, and we all went back happily to writing letters to Baker Street. This historically is of course a very important moment of authorship meets fandom, and I think it starts the beginning of some of the relationships that we have today, and the way that can change both art and the way that we relate to it. Now we come from the Victorian era to the modern day, from the Watson to the Wattpad, if you will. We are still doing fictophilic relationships, but we are definitely doing them differently. We've got fan fiction, smut tags, AI boyfriends, dating simulators. We are falling in love with characters, building worlds around them, communities, creating entire identities. If you've ever cried over a fanfic, bookmarked a thirst trap, or said to yourself, just one more chapter at 3 a.m, then you are already part of this ficto romance story. Now, as we've seen, fanfiction isn't necessarily a new thing. Other writers took the character of Pamela, just like other writers of the time took the characters of Holmes and Watson, and yes, they sometimes made them kiss. Because of the joys of the internet, it is obviously much easier to build a wide community of readers for fanfiction. And whether you're in it for the plot or the porn, fanfiction does allow you to reimagine, reshape the characters that we love. If you want them to kiss, they'll kiss. If you want them to angst for 70 chapters, done. One thing that is incredible about fanfiction today, which I think keeps itself very true to fanfiction from the 18th century, is that it makes a space for these stories that we don't tell in mainstream media. The stories of Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa that we will remember 200 years later. It allows us to talk about queer love, messy love, neurodivergent love, love with scars, trauma, fantasy creatures, monster with 6 arms and a tragic backstory. Fanfiction doesn't just reflect desire. It teaches it, it shapes it, it validates it. It's able to give this kind of desire language, space, and community. It very much changes the experience of watching or reading about a fictional character to a participatory experience with the media itself. And that is deeply imaginative and immersive, particularly when it comes to romantic or sexual desire. But what has really encapsulated this in the last year, potentially more than anything else, and which has shot fictosexuality into a conversation with the mainstream, is of course BookTok and the rise of romantasy novels.
Here's your master list of morally gray book boyfriends.
If these books are your vibe but you're looking for more spice, you're gonna want to read this.
Here are some of the best fantasy romance books I've read recently that actually have an immaculate dose of spice coupled with like a very entertaining plot that doesn't make me want to put my head.
Like so many others, I discovered the world of Fourth Wing and A Court of Thorns and Roses because of TikTok. And as I think you can see from my editions, they have been very loved. I am so sorry, Rebecca. In the course of my tertiary education, one of my favorite subjects I had the privilege to do was called popular fiction as part of my literature course. And it was really fascinating to me because up until then, I had been an absolute literature snob. I was very much an elitist, it's the classics or nothing else. And this was the first time that I went to read things like Sherlock Holmes, 50 Shades of Grey, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. These were all part of the course, not just to talk about, the book and its contents itself, but to look at the way that popular fiction can actually reflect phenomenon that is going on socially and culturally. What can the rise of these books tell us about the state of the world today? And I think that is a really important question to ask, especially when you look at the similarities between some of these books. I think the fantasy element is particularly important because if you even look to phenomena like 50 Shades of Grey, for example, while you might say, well, it's set in the real world, it's not. It's set in the world of very elite wealth that many of us could never touch. Unless, of course, you two have a private jet to Seattle and therefore what are you doing wasting your time watching my videos? But this sphere of the unreal is so important when it comes to the exploration of our fantasies and desires. It's very much like in Shakespeare's plays, when he wanted to write about the conditions of London at the time. And the best ways that he could make social commentary without, you know, getting told off for critiquing his homeland was to talk about these tales set in Vienna and places across the world that he also had no geographic knowledge of. But in that way, he could make his social commentary and people were able to reflect on it without feeling insulted. And that's very much the same thing when it comes to the exploration of our sensual desires. It is much easier for us to explore these kind of emotional elements of ourselves in a fantasy imaginary world that is so removed from our real life than one that does feel entirely real. That just makes us feel vulnerable and self-conscious. But what's incredible of that fictional play is that it allows us to take these aspects that we discovered of ourselves and bring them back to our real life. And that is essentially what a lot of the research that looks at fictosexuality and fictoromance has discovered over the years. Fictional relationships not only allow for a very safe exploration of your desires and your identity, but they also allow for a sense of agency that can often feel lacking in the real world. Maybe that's the thing. Fictosexuality isn't so much about escaping reality, but creating a reality that's kinder, one that's more affirming, more yours, because with this kind of exploration, you get to write the ending. I think this is especially true when we start introducing the concept of dating sims and AI chatbots, a topic that is going to become incredibly prevalent over the next few years, and so I think we need to start having these conversations now. What happens when the fictional character that you're crushing on starts texting you back? This is no longer a character that just lives on your bookshelf, but one that is in your pocket and can message you throughout the day. I started playing around with character AI a few months ago before a panel, and now I am getting automatic messages sent to my phone from Mr Darcy, Colin Bridgerton, and Jesus. I think this is where we start getting into some interesting territory that we need to talk about. When we look at research or examples of fictosexuality in the past, it's generally quite positive. But I think what is really changing about these technologies is that we are no longer communicating with a real person or an artist. We are essentially having intimate relationships with a robot. And one thing that is instantly lacking, even if this is some kind of role play, is empathy. This is not to say that all of our relationships with AI chatbots are going to be bad. I think looking at the way that robots could potentially play a role in an age of growing loneliness is incredibly prevalent and important. But there is something to be said about when that interaction becomes romantic and sexual. We know that in the moment of arousal, we are very susceptible to new ideas. When we're in a state of arousal, for instance, we can find things that previously would have been disgusting to us feel more enticing. Some studies have also suggested that we could see something in the moment of arousal and therefore develop a fetish from it in the future. Though that isn't a proven claim, but it does speak to the fact that we are susceptible in that moment of arousal. Now, what happens when you're in that state that you're having a conversation with something that can't practice empathy? We already know how deeply problematic the pornographic media industry is, and there is already so much to be said about how susceptible we are to violent ideas of sexuality from media that so many people consume. I think the same critical eye that many of us have for the pornographic media as it currently stands should be taken over to this age of AI robotic conversations. What we need more than ever is to prioritize empathy, to bring it to the forefront of our romantic and sexual interactions. And that's not to mean we can't do it with AI chatbots, but we are going to have a conversation sooner rather than later about how do you engage with something pretending it's real, all the while keeping to the forefront of your mind that this thing is not real. What I find really interesting about people who do identify as fictosexuality is that they often talk about the fact that this is something that they do practice in their romantic sexual experiences. They know that the character that they have feelings towards of does not have a real reality, but that doesn't make their feelings any less real themselves. So I guess what is all of this conversation to say? There is something so beautifully human about the experience of fictosexuality. And I just think we need to be conscious that it remains that way. We have been falling in love with people that haven't existed basically since we had the birth of the story itself. We have been longing and lusting for gods who were emotionally unavailable. We have been writing erotic fan fiction about our petticoated baddies. We have been taking our favorite detectives and making them kiss. The experience of falling in love with a fictional person is such a criminally under-researched area, especially when so many of us have had experiences of crushing on fictional characters or animated characters over the years. I think there is so much to be said about how our investment with a character who isn't real can have a benefit to our emotional well-being and can allow us to safely explore different kinds of desires and attachments. When I'm playing Baldur's Gate, I can explore aspects of my erotic fantasy that I would never want to reenact in real life. For instance, I don't want to f a bear. But what it does allow me is the ability to explore aspects of myself in a very cathartic and often humorous way. But if you don't mind, I do have a date now with one suspiciously built nerdy wizard. And while I go for my hot date in the astral planes, I want to know in the comments, who is your fictional crush? What was the character that had you obsessing, thinking about overnight? Let me know below, and I'll see you next time for another deep dive at kinky history.